Hello, everybody. Welcome to our webinar today on designing inclusive surveys. I know this is a topic that has been top of mind for many of us in recent years, if not longer. So we're excited to dive into this content with you today. So I'm Sarah, and I'm joined here today by my colleagues, Julie and Merva. And I personally am so appreciative that we have the opportunity to spend our time and energy on topics of diversity, equity, and inclusion. So how we as a market research industry ask demographic questions has been something that caught my attention when I first started my career in this field. And I'm sure we've all seen many different ways to ask about a person's identity, and often they can have a profound impact, whether that's on the person answering the question, on the perception of the brand or the organization asking it, or on the findings from the data analysis, the data quality itself. So I was glad to join the Insights Now team and our collaborators in our mission to identify some best practices.
I told everyone not to make sure they weren't off mute, and I just did it. So here we go. Hi, thanks, Sarah. I'm Julie Quante, and over the years of my research career, we've seen this question in surveys over and over, and I've always been uncomfortable with it and questioned why we were asking it if the reason wasn't evidence. And we say simply representative of census, and I don't feel like that's enough. It doesn't look at the person, it just looks at numbers and quotas. So I'm really excited about this research as we dive much deeper into the questions, the formats, and the emotional reactions that people have to this question. And remember, these are the people that are taking our surveys, and we want to look to develop a better and more inclusive way to ask the question.
Hi everyone, I'm Merva Marina. So I really wanted to be part of this process because screener building is a little bit personal for me. And every time I come across this question and how to build it, I always kind of question myself and I'm like, who am I missing? Like, am I actually being inclusive? So when this project came about, we started having these conversations and I was like, you know what, if I'm building a screener and I feel like I'm not being inclusive while I build a screener, I can't imagine what the person going through my screener is feeling. So it was definitely important for me to be part of this team.
And we'd love to hear from you, our audience, about what brings you here. There is in your sidebar menu a question panel. Feel free to let us know and hear what brings you to our webinar today, what you're interested in learning about, or if you have any questions throughout the presentation, please put them in here. We will do our best to answer them as we're moving through the slides. But if we don't get to it, aren't able to get to it, we have some time reserved at the end for Q&A. Also, if you're experiencing any technical issues, please reach out to our team here and we'll do our best to help you. So today our aim is to get through a few points. First, we want to provide an exclusive behind the scenes look at how we conducted our research on research to identify the most inclusive and sensitive race and ethnicity demographic questions. We specifically want to look at what can market researchers such as ourselves do? What are some insights for us that we can apply to our day-to-day work? And we will be doing a deep dive into methodologies and other useful ways that we can apply these methods.
All right, so how did we get here? Over a year ago, there was a group of us at Insights Now that were passionate about the topic of race and ethnicity in surveys, and we set out to reshape the format that the industry has traditionally used. There was a lot of information about research and hiring practices and staffing, but not the heart of research, which is the people that we want to gather information from. We wanted to actually go deeper and understand the deep emotional response that people were having to seeing and answer these questions. So basically, not just do you like this question, which is typically what we ask in research, but how does it make you feel? So get that deeper, more emotional level. So as we began our inquiry and development process, as I said, it was over a year ago, we also found that we were working in a parallel path to the Insights Association Idea Council. We had a discussion and we formed a partnership with them, and it set this research and process on a much larger stage. So our goal was to develop a recommended approach that was inclusive and sensitive to all identities. We worked alongside many partners who are shown here who also contributed to the research. So let's dive in. We said it was going to be a deep dive, so here's the methodology. So we started with 10 different race and ethnicity question formats. Some were long, some were short, some were intentionally bad. And we heard from nearly 5,000 people in a balanced sample based upon demographic responses. The survey was also available in English and Spanish, and it was also mobile friendly. One note is that we did not intentionally balance to the US Census because we wanted to have the opportunity to hear from more diverse sample than what you get with your average study. So we decided to tackle this question about the consumer experience to answering these questions from multiple angles, designing questions that activate different brain processes to get the more complete picture. We gathered all of these different data points into an index score to summarize the insights to allow for comparison against different question types. So this survey flow started with our calibration exercise of fast or slow, implicit and explicit responses. This is a proprietary method developed by Insights Now and allows us to look at each person's response time individually. The next activity was the initial survey participation and exposure question. Just a few questions of how many surveys do you take and what type of demographic questions do you typically see? We then asked the priming question, and there's going to be more detail about that a little bit later. But the purpose was to get the person in the mindset about telling a story of their experience, in this case, about answering a survey where they ask about race and ethnicity. So we asked that question, they told their story, answered it, and then the survey began with an evaluation of the different types of questions. Question types were randomly assigned, and there was a requirement that they did have to answer the question up front. We then asked a series of questions about their emotional responses to this question, followed by a scale-based question on how well did this question capture your identity. We then showed two other of the possible questions that they didn't originally see that they were asked, and then we did a paired comparison. So they saw two groups of these. So in total, 5 questions were seen. And then we finally followed up with some additional demographic questions. And just a little caveat there, not everything is included in this webinar that we asked. So as we mentioned, there were 10 question formats, and feel free to scan the QR code there if you want to see them. I'm going to go through them, but it's going to be quick. So, and give a little explanation about the question. Obviously, as you will see, there are so many different ways we can ask this question. We tried to kind of combine short, long, some different combinations of ways questions were answered, and actually we also included a kind of modified of the US Census as well. So let's dive in, and we're going to look at question 1 just real quick. Again, you can scan that QR code if you want to see it. But question 1 was a 2-part question with Hispanic yes, no, and then a short list of options, but it was select all that apply. Then jumping to question 2, that was a short list with common options and then an other, but note only a select one answer, not a select all that apply on this one. Question 3 was a common short list, select all that apply, but there's an other, and I can actually write in for the other. Question 4, same list, select only one, no write-in option. So the most limiting question was question 4. Question 5 was a select all that apply option, but then instead of that other that we've seen, I prefer to self-identify, and then I can write that answer in there. Question 6 was a select all that apply as well, and then other, but notice there's a pretty short list of options for question 6. Question 7 was a 2-part question. This was the one that was modified from the census. So it starts out with the first part, the Spanish, Hispanic Latinx question, and then goes into part 2, which is a more detailed and select all of that apply. We can jump to the part 2. There we go. So this would be a more detailed select all that apply, and then there's another race option down at the bottom. Question 8 was a more descriptive census-like question. Again, a select all that apply option and not listed, as opposed to we've seen other or self-describe at the bottom. Question 9, simply an open-ended response. Just please describe. And then question 10 was the most detailed. It began with a descriptive list. Select all that apply. The 2 that are in red were, if those were selected, then a follow-up question was asked that was much more detailed about either of those that came from that first question. So we had the Asian follow-up and the Hispanic follow-up, which is on the next slide as well. So very detailed, a lot of options in that question 10. So here's the question. So we wanted to say, how do people feel? This was the answer to that priming question of how do people feel when they see this question, when they answer this question. So looking at just the open-end responses, they haven't seen any of the questions yet, but when you see this in a survey, how do you feel? So the question was, think about the last time you were asked about your race or ethnicity in a survey. How did it make you feel? So analysis of these open ends showed that 3/4 of respondents had a positive reaction. We saw comments straight from the people that are answering our surveys is that some were fine with it, didn't have a problem with it. Others felt like it was pretty routine, pretty typical, kind of been there, done that. And other people were confident and didn't have a trouble or an issue saying what their race was. However, 3/4 were okay, but that also means that 25% or 1/4 had a negative experience answering the same question that they described in their priming story. And some of those included responses such as, I felt empty, as if that one word was all that was describing me. And I felt disconnected. I'm being put into a box. It's just a color. It doesn't describe me or my morals. It's something that it doesn't define my whole person. And someone was disgusted about it, that they just felt like it created bias. So again, this is 1/4 of the people that are responding to the surveys had this strong emotional response. So how are they going to respond to the rest of your survey if they're already in this kind of negative emotional state? So that's kind of what, define the problem. And we see that what the problem is some people are okay with it and some people have a negative emotional response to it. So the question is, do we really need to ask this question at all? And if the answer truly is yes, what's the best way to do that? So I'm going to turn it over to Merva, who's going to go into and explain how and why the data that we collected.
Okay, hi everyone. So I want to do a little bit of behavior education for you all. Here at Insights Now, we're really a collective of researchers who are really just interested in the nuanced behavioral elements that are kind of unveiled through the research process. Now, what we know about behavior is that it's a combination of elements. So it really made sense for us to build a methodology that's going to capture different ways of information processing. And we managed to collect 3 responses using the 3 evaluation methods. Those were implicit, explicit reactions. I think it needs to hit on the screen. Perfect. Scales and ratings, and then forced choices. So essentially, we knew that the brain is processing each of these question formats differently. And so with that insight, we were able to collect more robust data that gave us basically a stronger, more emotional and telling story. So let's move on. Perfect. Okay. Just a second. Okay, so first I want to kind of go through the implicit, explicit modes of thinking with you all. there are three systems or three modes of thinking. Now, in this specific research, we went through implicit and explicit. We didn't really cover prospective mode of thinking, system 3. That didn't really apply here because it's future-based. So I'm going to go ahead and do a little bit of a deep dive into implicit and explicit. So system 1 is an implicit reaction. These reactions are typically context dependent, and they're going to offer you immediate, accurate, implicit emotional responses. So think about it as automatic, fast, and most of the time it's unconscious. So system 1 thinking is going to give us that insight into the feeling that happens quickly. So what do you feel with that knee-jerk reaction when you see something? So again, it changes based on the context. And in this specific scenario, it worked perfectly for us because we adjusted each race and ethnicity question, like the context of it, so that it fuels a different emotional reaction. Now, on the other hand, with system 2 thinking, system 2 mode of thinking, explicit, this one is a little bit more rational and cognitive. It's a type of thinking that's kind of done at a deeper conscious level. So typically when a decision is difficult, or if you're triggered or encountered by something unordinary, anytime you have to like pause, stop, and think a little bit longer, you're using explicit mode of thinking. We can move on. So you might be wondering, how are we collecting all of these emotions? Well, the output is the percentage of people who have one of the 4 responses. People are either going to respond a fast yes, a fast no, a slow yes, or a slow no. So when we look at the example to the right of the screen, if you were to answer this question with a fast yes or a fast no, you're using implicit mode of thinking. So quick, fast, unconscious mode of thinking. And when you're responding slowly to this type of question, yes or no, slow, you're using explicit mode of thinking, a little bit more rational, a little bit more deeper level thinking. And so what we do here is we measure the response time, and that calculation tells us which mode of thinking is being used. So next slide, please. What we know about emotions is that they're discrete reactions. They happen very quickly, and they're usually defined by scientific principles. And so all of these emotions can be psychologically measured because they're basic emotions. So we ask people to choose yes or no to one of the words on the screen, and their emotion is being divided into positive or negative, and the response time to that is being captured as well. So the question, one more time, can we go back? So the question that was asked was, when I read this question, I felt, and let's say angry pops up on the screen and you click it really fast, or you click it fast and it's like, yes, I'm angry. That is going to be a negative implicit emotional reaction. So let's move on to the next screen. Here, I wanted to show you the scores, the difference between the scores of the implicit responses, so the fast yes and fast no responses. I'm going to do a little bit a deeper dive and show you a pattern in the fast yes, the positive ones. So the green are the positive responses, the fast yes responses. So with these patterns, we notice that within the positive emotions, when you look at question format 2, 7, and 9, people had stronger positive emotional associations with these question formats versus others. This little data point was also interesting to us because if you look at question format 4, now we thought when Julie presented this one, I'm not sure if you all remember or not, but it was the shortest one of all. Now, our team of researchers, we were like, oh, this question is going to get the worst feedback and it's not going to do good. Surprisingly enough, there was 66% positive emotional response to question format 4. So there is some general liking towards it. Let's move on. So we didn't only capture basic emotions, we also captured sentiments. Sentiments were also split into positive and negative. And we thought these were really cool and important to capture because sentiments are a little bit more complex than emotions. They're aggregates of emotions, so they're not as fast fleeting. Now, what we know about sentiments is that they're social constructs, and these social constructs are usually based off of person's personal experiences. So a sentiment is also more likely going to be influenced by a person's culture, their upbringings, or even their sense of self. So how you respond to this sentiment is a little cool. So I'll show you what we did here next. Let's go on to the next slide. So I showed you how for the basic emotions, we calculated just the fast yes responses. For sentiments, we wanted to do a calculation on all of them. So what we did is we did an overall weighted mean score of all the responses. So we did a weighted score of all the fast yeses, all the fast nos, slow yeses, and slow nos. Again, because sentiments are a little bit more complex, we wanted to capture all of the data responses. Okay, so when we look at the weighted mean scores here, we're noticing similar patterns. So question format 4 is still a little bit on the lower side for positive sentiment association. And then question format 8 continues to have the positive sentiment score. So moving on, next we asked a simple scale-based question on how well the race and ethnicity question captures somebody's identity. Honestly, we just wanted to give people the time to think through on how this question connects with who they are. And we're like, let's put in a simple scale-based question in there. So, yep, let's go ahead and take a look at those results. Now, again, with the scale-based question, we were a little bit surprised. We saw new winners here. If you can see, if you've been keeping track or not, question format 5 is now emerging and question 10 is emerging a little bit as a winner too. Let's move on to next. Lastly, we gave the option of forced choice questioning. At this point, people were able to see different format question types, and they made a selection based on which one best captures their identity. They see 2 questions on the screen and they select one. We thought this behavior metric was, or we can stay here. We thought this behavior metric was a little bit cool because it forces you to choose something that you may or may not believe matters, but subconsciously you're forced to choose a preference. So that forced response also kind of surprised us and affirmed that question 5, 8, and 10 were also the winners for paired preference as well. Okay, so you might be thinking, what do we do when we have all these nuanced data points, and what do we do with all of this stuff? Well, our team kind of came up with an overall index. And actually, Sarah's going to walk you through that next. So thank you.
Thank you, Merva. So we had all these questions for each of the question types that we tested. We were measuring implicit responses, sentiments, how well it captured someone's identity, and how often the question would win in a head-to-head comparison. But to have one metric that we could look to compare and contrast among the different options, we put together this composite index score. And so this index is an aggregate of the positive and negative implicit emotions, the positive and negative sentiment scores, the mean identity, how well it captured the person's identity, and the percentage win rate in the paired comparison. And what this overall index score was able to do was provide us some clarity on the performance or the relative performance across these multiple measures. When we looked at just the overall index score for the 10 questions over all of the people who participated, we saw a few clear leaders. So question types 8, 10, and 5 really came out on top. whereas question type 4 was the least successful and severely under-indexed in comparison. So the value of indexing in this situation is that it takes into account all of the ways that we have evaluated the question, all of the ways that the brain works to process and respond to the different questions, ensuring that we have a more complete picture when making decisions, when there isn't a simple or an obvious winner. We can also use index scores to simplify the process of comparing and contrasting among many groups. So there are a lot of ways to dig even deeper to get more insights, such as cutting the data to look at people by race or by generation. So I have a couple examples of what that looked like when we dug deeper. When we looked at these index scores among people of different racial or ethnic identities, we saw that questions 8, 10, and 5 were more valued than other question types, especially among non-white groups. So you can see those blue boxes are index scores over 120. It was different across groups of different identities, but we saw who were really responding to these different question types. Very interestingly, I want to call out question format 1. That's that two-part question. First, are you Hispanic, yes or no? And then the second part of the question is a multi-select for race. This question in particular is very common in surveys that we see today, and it is scoring pretty well for people who identify as Black or white, but really underserving those who are Hispanic or Latino or Asian. The open-ended response question, also very interestingly, did not outperform the others, which was a hypothesis we had going in, is whether or not this would be better than a closed-ended question. And I did see one of the audience questions come in while we were talking about different slides. The demographic breakdown we had for this study sample, or this group of people, was 20% for each of these groups that you see on the screen. So it is not representative to census. We purposely wanted to include more people of color, more people who identified as non-white, to understand the inclusivity and sensitivity aspects of these questions. When we looked at the data across generations, we saw that question formats 8 and 10 in particular were more valued among younger people, so millennials and Gen Z, whereas question 10 did quite well across most generations. I'll give you a moment to just look at those and see how some questions resonated with younger versus older people. So to sum that all up, how can we improve this experience when asking about race and ethnic identity? A few common characteristics that we saw is, first, to employ this multi-select format. Allow people to share their full identity, to see different descriptive response options, and also to give them an out if they don't feel comfortable answering or simply do not wish to share, including that prefer not to identify answer choice is important. Not using the word other. It's very alienating to be other, to have to select an option that says other. Some other language options, alternatives that you can use that we have tried and saw perform well are: I identify as another race, ethnicity, or origin. I prefer to self-identify, or even not listed was better than just other. And giving people that option to write in their own words how they would like to describe themselves. And finally, having specific and descriptive response options goes a long way, including language that is both Black and African American, or Hispanic and Latino or Latina. Allows people to see themselves and select what resonates the most with them. Including specific nationalities, countries of origin, or tribes also helps to have something for people to respond to, as well as having more regional categories instead of broad general response options. So moving forward, a few closing thoughts. First, ask yourself, do I need to ask the question about race and ethnicity at all? we saw that there were negative emotional responses, negative experiences across the board. So if you don't need to ask the question, consider not including it. Consider your objectives, your audience, and the context for your research. And if you do need to collect information about the race and ethnicity of your people, please employ select format and language approaches that we've identified here. So allowing people to select more than one option, using descriptive language, and not using the word other. Of course, we can continue as an industry to test different methods, to evolve and to learn more as we move forward in our process. And then finally, Insights Now is going to be continuing this research in collaboration with the IDEA Council. Our next topic will be jumping into gender identity and sexual orientation, very important topic, and we would like to invite you to join us. So if this is something that you or your team are interested in exploring further, please don't hesitate to reach out. So thank you very much for tuning in. Let's take a look at some questions. All right, here's a good question that I saw a couple people have asked, and Julie or Merva, feel free to jump in here. But do we have any recommendations for those who do need to include this question in the survey about where in the survey to include it?
So we had discussed this and we felt that if you have to ask the question, it's better to put it at the end of the survey, if possible, because, as we saw that emotional response, 25% of people don't even like seeing the question. So at the end is a better position than putting it right up front and getting that emotional response before anyone has even answered any of your questions. So I see another question about, did anything surprise us about the findings? And yes, as we said, when we, were working on the questions and the question formats, we were expecting that some of these were really bad, and select one and you give a list of 5 options, that question 4, and we expected there to be more of a difference of, wow, that's a really bad question. And it really didn't, with looking at each of the individual emotions, at the scale-based questions, and that it didn't really pop differently. But that was, again, why we use the indexing, is gathering all that information together. Then we broke out those differences and we were able to see really what was going on. So yes, it did. I anticipated, putting these questions in and putting in the census question and some of these really, really specific questions. Someone had mentioned in the chat that they liked question 10 because of all the options there. However, was there too many? Were there people that would say, I'm not reading through this list, there's too many options? So it was, kind of an interesting dichotomy of, oh, I thought people maybe wouldn't like that question because it was so long. There's been a lot of discussion about that open-ended question. Well, if we're not sure, just ask that open-ended question, and we can see it did not perform that well, which was also surprising, because if people didn't like not having options, an open-ended is the epitome of all options, and still that wasn't really something that people really wanted, was to have too many choices.
I see a question from someone in the audience. They say that usually they do have to describe the target consumer, for example. So do we have any suggestions for how to do that? And I think that when we're talking about diversity in our audience or in our consumers, there are a lot more metrics that we can use. Maybe race and ethnicity is relevant for your situation, but in a lot of cases it might not be. We could be looking at other motivators, other demographic elements, or even non-demographic, so it has nothing to do with what the person looks like or where they come from, but psychological, maybe what their motivators or goals are. So great question. I think there are other ways that we can look at making our sample representative. And as an industry, we can continue to explore what that looks like.
So there's a question about using these types of questions, these emotional questions in relation to food. And shameless plug, we do that in Insights Now a lot, that we do ask maybe the emotional response to your brand, the emotional response to your product once someone has tasted it. And it's really interesting what comes out, because you don't maybe know what people think about your brand, but we can get that emotional response. And is it positive? Is it negative? Is it you know, something that you're surprised about? As we said, we were kind of surprised about these results. So yes, we definitely do that in the context of food a lot at Insights Now.
I think that's actually a great segue into an announcement that we wanted to share with you all. Our upcoming webinar for the month of June is going to be about applying our implicit test to a different type of situation. We're going to be sharing, along with one of our brand partners, a recent case study on disrupting the packaging industry. So looking at different product claims and what is nudging and disrupting the consumer. So if this sounds like something that you're interested in, please stay tuned for more information, or pencil it in on your calendar. We'll be talking about this through our Webinars Now series on June 16th. Okay, well, thank you all for tuning in. It's been a real pleasure. If you have any more questions or are interested to learn more, please feel free to reach out to us through our website or through our emails. We'll be happy to chat with you and continue the discussion. Okay, thank you so much.